Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. For those of you who are with me on the live stream, I apologize for the technical difficulties, and hopefully I've got those resolved here. It is Wednesday, December 11th, 2019. And today, while most people in politics are focusing on the impeachment circus, they are focusing on joining one political team over the other. We've got another great example of bipartisanship at its absolute worst. That's a huge spending bill known as the NDAA. That's the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2020. It's just about to be passed by Congress. It's due to potentially be voted on by the Imperial House today. We expect it to be passed shortly after by the Senate, and it will most certainly be signed by the President. So today I'm going to cover just what they're doing, how much they're spending, what restrictions that were actually good that were in the bill originally a few months ago, but were removed before being sent off for passage, some warnings from the great John Taylor of Caroline and James Madison, another report showing that they've spent about $6.5 trillion on the war on terror so far, and it continues to grow and grow and grow, plus efforts in 2 states to resist unconstitutional foreign deployments. First of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We have a number of live channels on video. We have archived editions, podcast, audio only versions. You can find all of those, all of our previous episodes, ways to follow us, ways to subscribe, how you can support us in our membership program for as little as $2 a month, and so much more. Find that all over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out. That's basically the homepage for this show on the 10th Amendment Center website. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Looking over at the live chat before getting into the show, I appreciate everyone who mentioned, as I had a false start on the live broadcast, mentioning that I was having some problems with the audio. I ended up just doing a restart and testing it out and doing a couple of test streams without actually broadcasting. And it looks like that it's doing much better based on what everyone is saying. PS Views over on DLive, sound is fine now. Essential Freedom, good here. And on the loudspeaker, Melody. I want to say hi to Tyler B., Richard Kramer, Mark over on Facebook, Dan Reed, and everyone else, Heather Rossi, EHP Training. If I've missed you, I apologize, but I'm very grateful for you spending some time with me today, whether it's live here on the live stream or later on in the archives. It all means a great deal. And for those of you who really want to help us out, and it's free and easy to do, smash the like button, continue leaving comments, whether it's live or in the archives, share the link, all those things, trigger the algorithms of the platforms you may be watching or listening on, and it tells those platforms to show the program to more people. So let's get into this. And I want to set as a foundation an important quote from John Taylor of Caroline. If you don't know who he is, Google him. This was a really important dude. Basically a good friend of Thomas Jefferson, a true supporter of federalism and the 10th Amendment. In fact, he was one of the people that helped introduce the Virginia resolutions of 1798, James Madison's resolutions against the Alien and Sedition Act. And he had this quote in an important book, one of his many. He was a really prolific writer, Tyranny Unmasked, that he published in 1820 or 1822, something like that. And we tweeted this one out just a few hours ago. Remember this when they give you another National Defense Authorization Act is our tweet headline. And the quote from John Taylor is, "National defense is the usual pretext for the policy of fleecing the people." So Taylor knew it back then, and he wasn't alone, clearly. And it's the same, if not far worse today. Because when they tell us that they're doing things for national defense, we shouldn't trust that they're actually doing things for defense, but instead they're doing it to rip us off. I often say that if they say it's for your safety, it's really a way to control you and take your liberty. So let's get into the reports that I've seen over the last day or two. And now this is something that's been covered over the last few months. They've been trying to get this thing passed, and it always passes every single year. Of course, I did an episode on it last year as well. But here from The Intercept, Democrat and Republican lawmakers in Congress's Armed Services Committee released a compromise bill on Monday that would authorize $738 billion in military spending in 2020, a $22 billion increase over 2019. Now, if you're just not really up to date on how much money that really is, I will show you in just a moment. But basically, the U.S. spends more on military than anybody else. So I think this quote from John Taylor really holds true, because you don't need to be more than most of the rest of the world combined or the leading countries combined to really be conducting national defense. And he talks about that a little bit more, and I'll get to that in a moment. Now, the bill, if passed, which we know it will, would formally also establish President Donald Trump's proposed Space Force as a sixth armed service and bring total annual Pentagon spending increases under Trump to more than $130 billion. I remember in the Obama days, and mind you, Obama, the horrible socialist, one of the worst big spenders in history, is still increasing over the previous administrations. And we're talking $600 billion, $650 billion, and this was considered an insane amount of spending. Now, of course, some people will always tell you that any decrease in military increases. Now, there's never actually a decrease in spending, really. People complain about a decrease in the rate of increase, and they call that a cut. So when Obama supposedly cut military spending, he was just cutting back the amount that they were increasing and still spending more than he had year over year, every single year. So it just, well, let's go a little further here. And I know I've brought this up before. This is from nationalpriorities.org. It's U.S. spending versus the rest of the world. And they say U.S. outpaces all other nations in military expenditures. World military spending totaled more than $1.6 trillion in 2015. So if we're talking 2015 numbers, the U.S. is already almost half of the entire world. At the time, the U.S. accounted for 37% of the total military spending of the entire globe. And in fact, if we compare it with the next 7 countries combined, the U.S. spends about the same as China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, the United Kingdom, India, France, and Japan. All combined are about the same as what the U.S. spends on military every single year. And here's John Taylor again. This is that quote, "National defense is the usual pretext for the policy of fleecing the people." And again, Tyranny Unmasked is the book. It was 1822. And where was the rest of the quote? "These are so far being suggested by national defense that taxation, however enormous, is uniformly swallowed by individual avarice, and nothing is laid by, even in times of peace, to meet the dangers as a precaution against which it is pretended to be inflicted." It's crazy. The treasure extorted. He's talking about treasure being extorted. This is fleecing, ripping people off. And he goes on, he says, "What is still worse, the pretext of defending nations by oppressive taxation defeats its object by its means." Summing that up, if you're supposedly defending people, you're protecting people, but yet oppressing people with insane level of taxes, that defeats the entire purpose. You can't really be safe unless you're free. And if they're putting this massive amount of spending year in and year out and increasing, then it just defeats the entire purpose. He goes on, he says, "It weakens nations by indisposing the inhabitants of a country to defend it. And why should they, if this masterly policy already takes from them as much as they can pay? No conqueror or tyrant can take more." Here from antiwar.com, this is Jason Ditz, a report from this morning. They say the House version of the 2020 NDAA set aside an irresponsibly large amount of money for military spending, but it also added some anti-war amendments and other very basic limitations. This was from a few months ago. I think it was July or August that they passed this piece of legislation. The original House bill actually was using the power of the purse to end U.S. military involvement in Yemen, but that was removed. Of course, once it gets to the leadership, that goes into the compromise bill. So how it goes is the House passes a version, then the Senate passes a version. And whatever side wants to put something positive in, it doesn't matter. I think it's mostly just grandstanding. Maybe somebody actually does something good once in a while and introduces an important amendment and it actually gets approved. Maybe they're grandstanding because they know it's never going to actually get in the final version, because once it gets to leadership, because they have different versions passed in each chamber, then they go into what's called a conference committee. And then the conference committee hammers out the negotiations, and sometimes it takes months. And what they released on Monday, which is expected to be voted on as early as sometime today, is this version that took out restrictions on funding and supporting the war of Saudi Arabia against Yemen. And then there was also language from Representative Matt Gaetz, a Republican down in Florida, that said any U.S. attack on Iran could only come with the passage of an authorization for the use of military force against Iran. So there's something bubbling in this Iran situation, because there are people who want to actually just make it clear that the funding can't be used for that, and that's getting pulled out of there. Going on, Jason says, that is to say, it preemptively aimed to forbid an authorized U.S. attack on Iran. The language is gone, he writes, and while theoretically the president is meant to be forbidden from unauthorized attacks, basically attacks that don't come with a declaration of war from Congress, which they haven't done since World War II, he said that's not the way that recent administrations have treated the law. Basically, everyone in my lifetime and beyond, in most people's lifetime, probably anybody's lifetime watching, they don't declare war at all. Here from the Cato Institute, this is Christopher Preble, and he's pointing out again his annoyance with this crazy amount of spending. He says, I'm generally annoyed by the top line, $738 billion, at a time when the annual federal budget deficit surpasses $1 trillion. How can they spend this much money when they're already at $1 trillion deficit? He said the utter failure of elected officials in both parties to come to grips with our fiscal catastrophe and align our overly ambitious strategy with our obvious resource constraints is frustrating in the extreme. And he also points out that it's almost certain that this NDAA is going to pass. And I just want to highlight the hypocrisy of it all. Nancy Pelosi, and I'm just going to focus on old Nancy. She doesn't return my calls for whatever reason. But Nancy Pelosi is out here running through articles of impeachment, basically saying that the president, who I'm no fan of based on the Constitution, but that she's saying the president is so bad that he needs to be removed from office, impeached, and then tried in the Senate and removed from office. He's so bad, he's got to be just kicked out, gone. But yet, the very same week, 24 hours earlier, they're giving what could be nearly $800 billion for him to direct the military. Mind you, part of the problem here, or the hypocrisy, is that they're claiming that he takes this money and uses it to bribe other governments. But we know that foreign aid is what that is anyways. And even though I don't think the bribery end is actually in those articles of impeachment, but that's been so much of the focus over the last few months, that this is a guy who will use money that's allocated by Congress in ways that it's not supposed to be used. And yet, even though he's supposedly so bad with this that they got to get him out of office, they just give him more money. So that to me tells me that all of this is just garbage, grandstanding, and these people absolutely can't be trusted. But also on Monday, we learned that there was a bunch of redacted or documents, some interviews with people that were involved in the operation of the Afghanistan war over the last decade. And it turns out that we've been lied to repeatedly. Here's an article that just basically covers some just entry-level stuff from Jacob Hornberger over at Future of Freedom Foundation. And he says, the Pentagon can't be pleased with the Washington Post today. That was on Monday. That's because the Post just disclosed a mountain of previously secret documentary evidence within the military showing that the Pentagon has been intentionally lying for years about the progress that it was making with its forever war in Afghanistan. Now, this was released by a Freedom of Information Act request, so it wasn't even like leaked documents. So it was a FOIA filed by the Post, and they filed it for months. They'd been stonewalled, and they finally got some documents released. Jacob goes on, he says, while the Pentagon has been publicly assuring the American people that its war has been going swimmingly well, the truth is that it's been the exact opposite. And I would urge you guys to Google this or read in more detail. I'll put this link from Jacob in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. But here's a couple of key quotes. One from Colonel Bob Crowley. He said, quote, every data point was altered to present the best picture possible. Surveys, for instance, were totally unreliable, but reinforced that everything we were doing was right, and we became a self-licking ice cream cone. These were people who were interviewed by an office called the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. They basically established this office in 2008 to investigate supposed waste and fraud in the war zone. And here we are almost 12 years later, and we're finally getting a report about that. And they weren't actually voluntarily giving us that report. They were taking it, keeping it classified. And it took freedom of information. Maybe someone leaked something or gave a hint to a reporter, something like that. But we learn a dozen years later that they've been basically lying to us about how things are going. This is $1 trillion that they've spent in Afghanistan. And that's how Hornberger puts it. He says, so there you have it, a $1 trillion war built on intentional, deliberate, and knowing lies, just like the Vietnam War was. And it wasn't just that, Colonel. There's a 3-star Army general. Here's how he put it. We were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing. What are we doing here? We didn't have the foggiest notion of what we were undertaking. And these are people who gave their views in secret. Most of the names have not been included. I'm not sure why these particular ones were included. Maybe that's bad. Maybe it's good. Who knows? Maybe they volunteered it. I don't know. But the fact is, these are very much engaged local commanders, general, a colonel, or a lieutenant general, a colonel, or actually that was a 3-star Army general who served in Afghanistan, a colonel, and many others are basically saying over and over, multiple different people, that this is just a waste. And it's another $1 trillion. So why, when something like that comes out, plus the person needs to be removed from office, the president, then throw them another $800 billion? None of these people should ever be trusted. But it's not just the $1 trillion in Afghanistan. Check out this report that came out last month from Brown University. They published it November 13th. It was released by the Cost of War Project, which is based at Brown University. And they say since late 2001, we're about 18 years in, the United States has appropriated and is obligated to spend $6.4 trillion on counterterrorism efforts through the end of 2020. $6.4 trillion that they've spent on these counterterrorism efforts. An estimated $5.4 trillion has funded and will continue to fund counterterrorism wars and smaller operations in more than 80 countries. 80 countries, they've spent over $5.5 trillion. And supposedly, we're still waiting to make America great. It's still not great. This is not enough spending. It's not enough military. It's not enough engagement. It's not enough countries. And there's so much that we have to be afraid of, while at the same time working to restrict the right to keep and bear arms, people's natural right to defend themselves here at home. And they go on, they say an additional minimum of $1 trillion provides care for veterans of those wars through the next several decades. So even if you're talking about kind of a long tail spending, let's say it's $2 trillion. Let's say it's $1 trillion. It's $1 trillion spent on wars that were never declared according to the Constitution, that are illegal from the beginning, that should not be being waged. I mean, let's say they followed the Constitution. I don't think the spending would be this insane anyways, because Congress would have to take responsibility instead of just passing the buck from president to president. And then every few years, the people get really pissed off at the current president and vote into another one, because it's always the president to blame, and Congress keeps getting reelected. The incumbency rate is, the retention rate is pretty huge there. And here in the tweet, the Cost of War Project put this out again mid-November. It's a pie chart. I'm not sure if you're able to see it in full detail here, but basically overseas contingency operations is about $2 trillion. Another man, let me see if I can get this. Increases to bases, another almost $1 trillion. Homeland Security, $1 trillion. Veterans care. There's an interest payment of almost $1 trillion. So they add it up, and it's a ton of money, plus the $1 trillion they're expecting to have to pay for veterans over the next 40 years. And even though I would say much of it never should have been spent in the first place, can you imagine? I mean, if anything, like to leave those people out high and dry, I know some people are just heartless. I don't, the government shouldn't be involved in any of this stuff, really. But then another $1 trillion, of course, people need to be cared for. And I think that creates this whole self-perpetuating thing, because people will say, don't let them die in vain. You got to continue the war. And then another person dies and they can't die in vain. They have to care for them, and on and on and on. And that really kind of gets back to what John Taylor was saying, is that it creates this cycle of ripping people off. It creates these never-ending situations where you have these bureaucracies where they're continually taking more and more money. And that's basically what James Madison said as well. And he put it this way: the means of defense against foreign danger have always been the instruments of tyranny at home. And for those of you who watch this show or listen to it regularly, you know I cite Madison talking about how he thought war was the greatest threat to the public liberty, because war leads to armies and debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments, according to James Madison, for putting the many under the domination of the few. So the more that you have to defend against foreign danger, the greater you have to have bigger armies, you have to have more taxes, more debts, and those are the instruments of tyranny. And here's the full quote from him. This was, let me see if I can find this. My bookmarks are a little here it is. A standing military force, he says, with an overgrown executive will not long be safe companions to liberty. Let me say that again. A standing military force with an overgrown executive will not long be safe companions to liberty. What a very clear warning. And people who blew that off, I think Madison has been right all along. And he says the means of defense against foreign danger have been always the instruments of tyranny at home. Not sometimes, not most of the time, not once in a while, but always. Now, Richard Kramer makes an interesting point. He says espousing the care of veterans and that we should honor them is nothing more than perpetuating the usurpations. And I'm a retired veteran. And that's how I feel as well. But at the same time, I feel compassionate. But of course, it's so wrong to be compassionate with tax money. And sooner or later, if it's not this whole circle, this vicious cycle of sending people off to defend us against supposed dangers, blocking people from defending themselves at home, creating people getting killed or having to be cared for, and then having to spend more, and then having to send more people so those people don't make a sacrifice in vain. Richard Kramer is absolutely right in the chat in saying that the whole thing perpetuates this. And even me just talking about this, I'm encouraging people to perpetuate that. And I shouldn't. That's totally wrong. Sooner or later, it's going to have to be cut off. Eventually, the whole system is going to cut us off eventually, because things that can't go on forever don't. The spending can't continue forever. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I did an episode on a project here called the Defend the Guard Act, something that we're encouraging states to take action to resist some of this unconstitutional foreign deployment, something that's been happening year in and year out around the world. We see that 80 countries, just in the last 20 years, we've had engagement in 80 countries. It's not just Iraq. It's not just Syria or Libya. 80 of them. I don't have a list. Maybe someone will provide that for me, but it's huge. And I should probably dig into that report a little bit further. But I mentioned in that episode that we expected somewhere around 20 states or so to be introducing this legislation. We already have the first two. Legislative sessions really don't get underway until January or so in most states, some in February or March, and a few like Louisiana, Oklahoma. But a lot of states allow legislators to pre-file legislation, get it filed and going through the legislative process early. And for example, here in Oklahoma, just this last week, Senator Nathan Dahm filed Senate Bill 1101 that would ban the use of state guard troops for overseas deployment without a declaration of war as required by the Constitution. Pretty straightforward stuff. If you're in Oklahoma, you definitely want to get behind Senate Bill 1101. You could call your state senator, ask them to co-sponsor. Call your state representative, ask them to file a companion bill in the House. And the same thing in South Carolina. House Bill 4728 from Representative Stuart Jones. I think he's new. He's a Young Americans for Liberty guy, but he filed a very similar bill, basically saying that the National Guard can't be sent overseas to foreign engagements without, as what the Constitution requires, a military invasion, an insurrection, or a calling forth, basically in an emergency situation, to enforce the laws of the Union. So that's the first two. We will certainly be keeping track of which ones are coming as we see more legislation in the near future. We send out updates by email. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/register if you are not on our email list yet. Taking a look over on the live chat, Sampson says, if other nations had to spend money on military, would they have nationalized health care? That's interesting. General Smedley Butler was right about war, says Frank I, and Bob Ferguson gave an agreement. Melody Skaman, I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly. PNAC say we may need a century of war to secure global military dominance. Well, I would say, according to this report that again, from National Priorities, that is global military dominance. And then if we're talking about a sixth the Space Force, a sixth branch of the U.S. military, we're talking about the global dominance and space dominance. So 37% of the total. I know it's more than the next 7 countries combined, and it's about the same as all of the rest after the next 7. So after Japan, which is number 8 in spending on military, the next 130 or 140 combined are about the same, a little bit more than the U.S. as of 2015. My assumption, based on how these numbers grow, is that the U.S. is probably equal to or more than that as of this point. Richard Kramer points out, he says, by the way, I surrendered my pension, health care, of life, and VA disability. My children and grandchildren do not need to finance my decisions. That is really honorable. And I think more people need to follow that lead. That's a really important thing to do. Essential Freedom says, if we still had a gold standard, this wouldn't become an issue. They would have bankrupted themselves decades ago. And yes, that is part of the problem, because as long as they continue to print money and debase the currency, then they have more cash to go around. Even though it costs more, they keep just making it up out of thin air. And the gold standard actually having sound money, a hard currency, there's a limited supply. So in order to be able to spend the money, they have to aggressively raise taxes right off the bat. And then that is applicable through Congress and the people. And people feel it much more right away, and it probably encourages more resistance. Or they would go bankrupt. There's no way to be able to spend for all this stuff. So it's eventually going to hit. Because again, and I say this over and over, things that can't go on forever don't. It's not positive stuff. Of course, the NDAA is going to pass, and maybe this is going to become a yearly thing where I talk about how it just keeps increasing, and I'll continue to point out national priorities and compare how the U.S. is spending on military in comparison to the rest of the world. They never seem to stop doing it. Of course, we started following the NDAA much closer in 2012 or 2011, really, when for the 2012 National Defense Authorization Act, they included provisions that authorized the indefinite detention of anybody as long as the war on terror continues. And it's interesting that Melody pointed out that PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, which I don't think is still around, but they were basically the precursor. They had a lot of the plans. They pushed a lot of the white papers for the war on terror and Iraq. They were already there before September 11th, 2001. And they are talking 100-year war. We've heard a lot of people say things like that. As long as the war continues, you can be indefinitely detained. They've got to continue increasing spending. They've got to keep violating civil liberties. They've got to keep the massive surveillance up because terrorists. And just like James Madison told us, and let me pull this up again, it's timeless. The means of defense against foreign danger have been always the instruments of tyranny at home. And if we aren't living that right now, we are pretty darn close. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. It's irritating. It certainly should boil your blood a little bit, but I hope you learned something. If you enjoyed the show, if you like what we're doing here at the 10th Amendment Center, please smash that like button, subscribe if you're on YouTube, reviews over on iTunes and Stitcher or elsewhere. All the podcast editions are very, very helpful in getting the word out, helping us get the program to more people. We are consistently and regularly growing. We're getting more and more listeners and viewers, and I'm grateful for you all being here with me, whether it's your first time or you've been with me since day one. It is pretty awesome. Of course, if you want to pitch in financially, the link is 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. As little as $2 a month goes a long way. We'll be back here on Friday for a Fast Friday edition. I think I'm probably going to give you guys an update on the nullification movement because we've got so many new bills being filed on various issues like asset forfeiture, the Defend the Guard Act. We have a Second Amendment Preservation Act that takes on all federal gun control, past, present, and future in Missouri. We also have some legislation to stop mass surveillance in Michigan and also Missouri. But, hopefully if I can get that all coordinated, I'll do that episode on Friday. I'm not sure what I've got on deck for next week, but if you've got some ideas, feel free to email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I read everything, even if I'm not able to get back to everyone. Again, thank you so much for spending time with me today. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.